Greetings, my wonderful students, and welcome to this review of Mexico, Cuba, and Central America. Now, Mexico, in the 1900s, the Mexican Revolution created a one-party system. Between the 1950s and 1960s, Mexico's economy grew steadily. In the 1960s, people began to protest the one-party system, and a two-party system was instituted in Mexico. In the 1970s, oil reserves were found in Mexico, and the government became dependent on oil revenues. They created a nationalized oil company called Petroleum Mexico, Pemex. And unfortunately, in the 1980s, the price of oil dropped. As you can see in this graph, it had peaked after a long climb, and then it had crashed. And when it crashed, Mexico was unable to pay its debts. Because they had become dependent upon oil revenues, the Mexican government had borrowed heavily based on the idea that oil prices would remain high and they would be able to pay those debts. Once the price of oil crashed, they were unable to continue paying their debts. In the 1990s, Mexico, Canada, and the United States signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA. This agreement ended tariffs or reduced tariffs between the three member nations in an attempt to increase economic trade between all three of them. NAFTA did not solve Mexico's problems, though some businesses did end up opening in Mexico as a result of this. Now in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista was a dictator in Cuba from 1934 to 1959. In 1959, Fidel Castro, pictured here, led a communist revolution against Batista. Castro began receiving aid from the Soviet Union as a communist country in the middle of the Cold War. And as a result of this, the United States broke relations with Cuba and declared an embargo, a refusal to trade with Cuba. Now, the U.S. backed an invasion of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs in 1961. As you recall from our study of the Cold War, this invasion failed and it humiliated the United States. Believing that President Kennedy was weak, the Soviet Union under Khrushchev began setting up nuclear missiles in Cuba. This would have given the Soviets a first strike capability in a nuclear war. And President Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba and stated that the missiles that were there had to be withdrawn. For 14 days, the world hovered on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships eventually turned back and the missiles were dismantled. Now, Castro attempted to help start communist revolutions in Latin America. These attempts for the most part failed, but did create issues there. With the collapse of communism in Europe in the late 1980s, Cuba's economy declined. Castro gave up power to his younger brother Raul in 2008. In Central America, El Salvador experienced a civil war in the 1970s. And in Nicaragua, the United States helped a dictator fight against Sandinistas, Marxist rebels. And in Panama, gained control of the Panama Canal, which the U.S. had control of. Panama gained control of that in 1999. And that brings us up to date.